Today on Stronger Than Reason, we talk about a lot of songs by a lot of bands. Welcome to our first ever mixtape. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason, episode 80. This is a milestone, of course. Looking back, we did 50 episodes in 2023 and 29 in 2024, more or less as I predicted a year ago. But now that we're on a big round number, I thought it would be fun to do something a little different. See, there are just a lot of songs I love that are by bands that I don't think I could talk about sensibly for 30 or 40 minutes. So the idea here is to gather a bunch of these songs together into one show, kind of like an old mixtape, and throw them together and see what happens. And this will give me a chance to go wide instead of deep for once. And it isn't to say that I can't dive into one of these bands later. That can certainly still happen. But you know, it's an opportunity to keep things a little loose and fun here in the aftermath of the holiday season. And speaking of, I hope you had a good one. I look forward to the holidays in their own right, just because I like getting together with family and friends, but I also look forward to having a little break from work. I'm usually forced to take some time off before the end of the year, and it's become something of a habit to get a bunch of days off at once, since I'm terrible with taking time off when the weather's nice. But that's okay. There's something nice about being able to hole up here for a couple of weeks and just sleep in and do whatever, just take it relatively easy. But now it's back to work for me, and despite my admirable plan, I didn't manage to do anything over my break for this show. So yes, it's been an exceptionally long hiatus. I wish I could say I was spending that time on other productive things, but the fact is I mostly just ate myself into oblivion and stayed up way too late. I think I just needed what my kids call a brain break, which appears to have extended now well into January. So let's hope we're finally back to our regularly scheduled nonsense here. But first, I want to address something that a few folks have brought up, and it is this: actually playing the songs in question as I'm discussing them. And to be honest, this is something I would love to do. Part of what I'm trying to do with this show is convince you to listen to this music or to appreciate it. And that's really hard to do purely from description. The fact is, there's nothing I can say about a song that will move you as much as listening to the song itself. The problem, naturally, is YouTube and its copyright strikes. There are all kinds of fun punishments awaiting anyone who dares to put even a few seconds of copyrighted music in their videos. I should have made a podcast about reviewing books or visual art, because YouTube and podcast services are just heavily biased against sharing any sort of copyrighted music, especially with the services like Shazam and now every proprietary digital assistant that can just immediately identify a recording from the smallest snippet. So I'm putting a lot of time into this show, too much to want to take a chance that I'll either have to take down an episode or maybe lock my channel. And it would inevitably happen. I follow several channels that regularly feature others' music, and they get episodes taken down all the time. I guess those folks have the energy to fight these things. I know it's possible to appeal and whatnot, and I know there's a game you can play. I'm just not interested, because it takes all of my energy just to put this material together and get it out there. I don't need to spend time fighting a big taffy-like bureaucracy. I figure I can avoid that mess if I just keep the show to my own voice, and no one can flag anything if I'm doing that for copyright. Now, I read some confusing statements that it might be possible to add copyrighted music if and when I join the YouTube Partner Program, which as far as I can tell means when I hit the monetization tier. So at that point, maybe they would concede somewhat as soon as I start contributing to their revenue stream. The problem with that is that I don't foresee hitting that tier anytime soon, and even if I did, as I mentioned before, I doubt I'd change anything here. I'm not going to include ads on this show because ads suck. We need fewer ads in our lives, so I'm not holding out hope that anything will change in the conceivable future with regard to actually playing the songs. And again, I figure all of this music is just a click away for you. You know, if something I talk about piques your interest, you could easily find it. If you have Spotify or Apple Music or whatever, you already have it all and can listen to it whenever you want. And ironically, all the music I'm talking about is also readily available on YouTube, frequently thanks to folks other than the copyright holders. And what I don't get is why aren't these folks getting copyright strikes? I mean, it seems like at least 80% of YouTube is pirated content, people just reposting crap that other people worked hard on without attribution. So if you want to listen to any of this stuff and you don't subscribe to a music service, just do a quick YouTube search. I'd love to be able to serve it up right here in the context of the show, but that does appear to be impossible. I'm not going to pirate it, and I can't afford the time or dough to request use the proper way. It's ridiculous what you have to go through to request permission to even legally release a cover version of some song, you know, dealing with the Harry Fox agency and whatnot. And I don't know, maybe the problem here, folks, is that I'm a rule follower, and because of that, I'm just shooting myself in the foot and limiting the scope and interest that this show would otherwise have. And it bugs me, and I am thinking about it, but I keep coming back to the fact that A, the music is readily available if you want to hear it, and B, I'm not going to do anything that compromises my control, not after all the effort I've put into it. So if you have any thoughts or suggestions about this, let me know. Maybe there's a way out of this that I haven't thought of. But let's get back to this mixtape idea. What am I doing here? Well, I've picked some songs that I love, most of which are from bands I haven't talked about yet. It's a varied bunch. They are not just industrial or 80s bands or whatever, and I have a few stories for each. I'm just going to introduce them one by one and talk about them for a few minutes, and we will see where this goes. If it works, maybe we can do these periodically, okay? So here we go. First up is Crunch-O-Matic's song Slaughterhouse. Okay, this is a fun one for me because this here, what I'm holding in my hand, is the very first CD I ever bought. I bought it used from a store for maybe $3 before I even owned a CD player. So why did I buy it? I bought it because I caught the video for Slaughterhouse on 120 Minutes on MTV one night, and it struck me as a really cool industrial-style tune. The video featured every cliched early 90s video toaster effect imaginable, and the band also appeared to have a drummer who had a hot water heater in his kit. And that's really all it took to sell me. Back in the day, I knew nothing about this band other than that they had a video on MTV, and I tried desperately to find out more. And alas, the internet drew a blank for many years, but I think I finally figured it out. Crunch-O-Matic was composed of the folks from H-Gun Labs, who were, of course, the Chicago videographers who produced nearly every music video for Wax Trax, as well as some other industrial songs like Nine Inch Nails' Head Like a Hole. And Eric Zimmerman was a key figure here. His name shows up in a lot of the video credits at the time. Now, according to stories I pieced together later, and I'm not sure how correct this is, when H-Gun was working with NIN, they pirated digital audio workstation software from Trent Reznor and started messing around making their own music. And that's supposedly why there's a credit on their full-length album, Caution Do Not Play, for additional data courtesy of Trent Reznor. And I used to own that album, but evidently I sold it a long time ago. From what I recall, it wasn't nearly as good as this single, despite having another version of Slaughterhouse. It was just pretty much boring by the numbers techno for the most part. Even the album version of Slaughterhouse wasn't as good as this one. The video uses the single version. It's specifically the so-called transportation mix, which is badass. The video is funny since it shows all these guys playing the song live with tons of gear, but I am pretty sure that this song was entirely sequenced. And I never really heard of Crunch-O-Matic playing live ever. After all, these guys made videos for a living, so it's no surprise that they managed to doctor up a video for their project. Anyway, this is my first CD, I still think it's a killer song, though one I don't really listen to much anymore, I have to admit. But apart from anything else, you gotta love this logo. I mean, look at that. That's so cool. Crunch-o-matic. I think there's a lot of marketing possibilities there, and it's too bad it never caught on. So that was our lead-off song, and we're going to move right along to the next one, which is a song called Never Say Never by a band called Romeo Void. Now, I never heard this song back in the 80s, but it is kind of a funny story how I first heard it. So 20 years ago, I was in grad school, and my advisor lent me a laptop so that I could do some research. This was the era of MP3 sharing, so it wasn't much of a surprise to find some MP3s on this laptop. And metadata was still pretty crappy, so the one file was simply named Romeo.mp3. And, I was curious, and I clicked it, and I had my mind blown. It was Never Say Never by Romeo Void. And sure, this song has a killer beat and bass line. It's one of those I wouldn't mind looping for about 20 minutes, just smack dab in the pocket and unrelenting. But what really blew me away were the vocals. There was this lady delivering the most blistering foot in your ass attitude. And I wasn't even sure if it was just one lady because the chorus kind of sounded like at least two, but it turns out it was just one, the now legendary Deborah Ayal. In this song, she sounds equally likely to punch you in the face or just drag you off to bed, or maybe both. And dropping as it did in 1982, I'm sure it challenged a lot of gender mores. Frankly, this is a song that just wouldn't work sung by a dude. It would come off as borderline assault, but Deborah Ayal sets it up perfectly, and particularly in the chorus, in which she sings what is perhaps the best single line in all of rock and roll: I might like you better if we slept together. So just let that one sink in for a minute, because it's at once a straightforward come on and just a blistering burn. And not only is it a brilliant distillation of rock attitude in itself, it's how she delivers that line that sends it home with just the right touch of sneering indifference. It's confrontational, and it's just a great expression of strength. It's just mwah. And if that weren't enough to pack in this song, you have these magic punk rock saxophone solos from the late Benjamin Bossy, R.I.P. Frankly, they elevate this song much more than guitar solos ever could, and they turn it into something else entirely. This is one of those songs that you definitely remember where you were and what you were doing the first time you heard it. I know I did. And if you haven't heard it in a while, check it out again, play it loud. It's killer. So keeping in the same era, we're going to jump to Stand Back by Stevie Nicks. And of course, Stevie Nicks isn't alternative. Stevie Nicks is a musical legend, best known for having been a vocalist and songwriter in Fleetwood Mac for many decades. But she also had a successful solo career in the early 80s, and her hits included some new wave essentials like this one. Now, I love every phase of Stevie's career. One of the 45s I grew up with was Fleetwood Mac's Sarah, so I've been listening to them as long as I can remember. I'm not too much of an alternative music guy to not be able to fully appreciate an album like Rumors for the masterpiece it is. And yeah, I'll still occasionally play Tusk or even Tango in the Night, because I love music that is impeccably written and produced, as nearly all Fleetwood Mac is. And I'm also a big fan of Christine McVie, R.I.P., and Lindsey Buckingham. I think Fleetwood Mac is unique. Most bands would be lucky to have one world-class songwriter or singer. Fleetwood Mac had 3, at least for the key part of their career. So it's easy to think of them as a 70s band, but they were still relevant in the 80s, producing new wave pop classics like Little Lies and Everything. And then Stevie goes and makes Stand Back solo in 1983. And the story of how that happened is actually pretty funny. She says she was driving in a car with her new husband when Prince's Little Red Corvette came on the radio. She was inspired to sing her own words and vocals to it as a backing track, and Stand Back was born. So later she was in the studio to record it and decided to call Prince to tell him how he had inspired her, as you do. And oddly enough, Prince then showed up at the studio, like Beetlejuice or Rumpelstiltskin maybe, like in a fairy tale. And he reportedly programmed all the drums and played all the synths himself. Now, reports differ, of course, but as the late, great Tony Wilson once said, if you ever must choose between legend and reality, always choose the legend. I just love the idea of Prince magically showing up and very generously helping Stevie reinvent his song. He is very generous with his talent, and Stand Back is a cool song. It stands on its own, even if it was a very typical synth-saturated 80s number that was, let's be honest, probably overplayed on the radio. But it's got some cool guitar on it, a good beat. I like it, and I don't really hear Little Red Corvette in it at all. One other thing does come to mind here. You might recall that Fleetwood Mac had a big comeback in 1997 with their live album and CD, The Dance, which reintroduced the classic lineup, including Stevie, to a new generation of fans, me included. Now, I bought this disc and the corresponding videotape on VHS, and I was mesmerized by it, as were millions of people, and it kind of reintroduced the band to pop culture at the time. And it's funny to think that back then we thought it was just a reunion of this once relevant and now old band. But in fact, at the time, they were just 20 years out from their heyday and were still relatively young and only halfway through their career as a functioning band. And as you might know, they more or less disbanded in 2023 following the death of Christine McVie. So let's move on now to something completely different. Another English band, one born from a little-known genre called grebo that mostly involved never taking a bath. Yes, it's Pop Will Eat Itself, specifically their 1989 single, Can You Dig It? It appeared on their second album, This Is the Day, This Is the Hour, This Is This. Now, this song was my first taste of PWEI, or the Poppies as they're sometimes known, because I had this mixtape that, if I recall correctly, was split into two sides, peanut butter and jelly, and which also featured such hits as the Morning Sun extended mix of New Order's True Faith and 808080808 by 808 State. Anyway, I was just amazed by Can You Dig It? It really stood out to me for a few reasons. First, for its amazing production. Later, I would find out that it was produced by none other than Flood, presumably around the time he was mixing Nine Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine. So little wonder there. The mix is great and hits really hard. Second, for its clever lyrics that reference all sorts of geek and school kid pop culture of the time, like comic books, movies, music, TV, toys, all the stuff that I was well familiar with in the late 80s. Third, for its kitchen sink arrangement, the cool dance beat, the tons of samples, and most importantly, the killer feedback guitar, some of which they sampled from Faith No More's We Care a Lot. Much later, though, this song would become my doorway to the 1979 cult film The Warriors, which it samples heavily. Riffs? Yeah! Which reminds me, I gotta get me a Baseball Furies t-shirt one of these days. The Warriors is just a great flick, now mostly a cult flick, which I was surprised to find is now available for free on YouTube with ads, though I should say that I watched it recently, and for whatever reason, I didn't see a single ad. Go figure. Anyway, this is just a super fun song, it's super catchy, and if you're of a certain age, you'll catch all the references and will want to sing along. I understand PWEI is still going strong with at least one original member, Graham Crabb. So fun fact, the guy who sang Can You Dig It, here doing his best Geddy Lee impression circa 1976, was their original vocalist, Clint Mansell, who is now one of the most sought-after film composers in the world, having scored dozens of films since 1998's Pi. He was nominated for a Grammy for 2012's Black Swan, and he composed the track Lux Eterna, not the Metallica song, which was originally written for the film Requiem for a Dream, but which was subsequently used everywhere, including in The Lord of the Rings. If there is a top 40 hit among movie score tunes, it is Lux Eterna. So very cool that Clint did that. So moving on, a song I was aware of as a kid during its heyday, but which I never consciously listened to until just a few years ago. This is Space Age Love Song by the band with possibly the second worst name in rock history, A Flock of Seagulls. And if you're wondering, the worst band name was Factory Records' own Crispy Ambulance. That's just terrible. Kids, don't do drugs. Anyway, when I was growing up, I somehow landed a sweet vinyl copy of K-Tel's Hit Explosion, which I still have, by the way. It's somewhere deep in the archives, cuddled up next to Pac-Man Fever and Weird Al Yankovic in 3D. But I can't be bothered to brave the radon and spiders to go dig it up. So this thing came out in 1983 and had such great stuff on it. Rush's New World Man, The Go-Go's Vacation, Joe Jackson's Steppin' Out, Joan Jett's Do You Wanna Touch Me, and of course, Space Age Love Song. Unfortunately, I was a moron, and I pretty much only played two songs, Survivor's Eye of the Tiger and Gloria. And not the good Gloria by Van Morrison, the one that is a pub rock standard, but the crappy one by Laura Branigan. So imagine my disgust when I grew up a bit and realized all the great music this disc had that I never bothered listening to as a kid. But what about A Flock of Seagulls? Well, I knew they existed because I had read their name on the album credits. I never really listened to their song, though, and I never thought about the band again until I saw Pulp Fiction in 1994. Because you may remember they were referenced in one of the early scenes when the hitmen raid Brett's apartment. The kid laying on the couch has the Flock of Seagulls haircut, so is referred to as such by Samuel L. Jackson. Did that make me want to check out the band? Of course not. So fast forward another 20 years. I was in a retro mood one night and I came across a video for their other big hit, I Ran. And I was pretty shocked to see that their guitarist appeared to be a little kid, or at least he looked like a little kid from my now advanced age. Turns out he was in fact remarkably young. Paul Reynolds was a teenager when the band released their debut self-titled album in 1982. The rest of the band were in their mid-20s, and I thought that was pretty strange. And since I thought I Ran was a pretty good song, I checked out some of their other stuff. I soon ran into Space Age Love Song, and wow, like what an amazing tune. I was kind of blown away. It's very simple, but something about it just puts me in a happy place, especially Paul Reynolds' guitar work, which is all about echoed arpeggios. It's really great stuff. So it's very post-punk. It's just taking the guitar in an unexpected direction. And even now, that song to me doesn't sound dated, especially the guitar work. I think this song also benefits, though, from me hearing it with fresh ears. So unlike I Ran, which was overplayed on the radio all the time, I really don't recall ever hearing Space Age Love Song before that. So, of course, this led me down a rabbit hole and ultimately led to me watching their big reunion on this silly show called Bands Reunited, which I wasn't familiar with. And as I watched this thing, I just got this sinking feeling in my stomach. What a crappy premise for a show. I mean, bands break up for a lot of good reasons because it's tremendously hard to keep a band going, even if it's successful. Tastes change, fans come and go, a band's momentary coolness turns into permanent lameness, and, suddenly the band's conscious that they're on the stage playing to a half-empty room, just watching the venues get smaller. The band members eventually get tired, or they find they'd just rather be doing something else. Or maybe there's bad blood. Maybe as they taste success, they start hating each other, taking things personally. For whatever reason, they eventually decide to hang it up. And everything comes to an end, folks. Everything does, sooner or later. Sometimes the courage is in recognizing that point for what it is and accepting it. I think the saddest thing of all in music is when bands refuse to recognize that point. and they mess up their glory days by clinging Gollum-like to their precious band to the bitter end, squeezing every last bit of dust out of the desiccated lemon. You know, maybe even bolstering the band such as it is with a bunch of younger, better-looking folks and continuing to drag your 60 or 70-year-old ass out on another tour, playing for the ever-shrinking pool of utterly irrelevant middle-aged fans who still think you've got it. And I say that with love, of course, seeing as I'm rapidly becoming one of those fans. Anyway, most bands do come to an end for one reason or another, and for a while, everyone is happy. The fans are happy that the band's legacy is intact, that they'll be remembered at their peak or close to it, and the band is happy that they can finally have something like an ordinary, stable lifestyle, perhaps a family, and experience this thing that's called life. And then years later, after their kids are grown up and the history books have all been written and forgotten, some ding-dong comes in with a microphone and a camera and gets in their face and wants to get the band back together. Why exactly? So the cynic in me says it's obvious, so the next generation can have a good laugh. I mean, think about it. The tacit comedy potential is rich, making fun of their hairstyles and clothes and all the historic footage, making fun of their lack of hair and the current footage, snarky comments about their appearance, talent, and desperate need for attention, you know, ignoring that the band might be getting goaded into this with a promise of a big bucket of cash. Unfortunately, my suspicions about the motives of this show were borne out by the show's attempt to reunite Information Society, and you could read all about that in Kurt Harlan's expose for yourself. It's linked to from the Bands Reunited page on Wikipedia. So I watched with some horror as one by one the former members of A Flock of Seagulls agreed to a one-off reunion and came together confronting past demons and present embarrassment to try to resurrect old ghosts. So yeah, Bands Reunited is something of a horror show, and like a train wreck, I found myself helpless to do anything other than watch. Although, I have to say that A Flock of Seagulls did, in the end, deliver the goods. They did, in fact, still have it, whatever it was, musical chops, style, power, although they ditched the silly haircuts, thankfully. That does not excuse Bands Reunited, though, from their terrible mission. But to me, the sound of Space Age Love Song evokes the huge guitar washes that would eventually dominate shoegaze. It's not too different from, say, something that School of Seven Bells might have come up with. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Ben Curtis had been a Flock of Seagulls fan. Anyway, I think it's still a great tune, and I'm happy to have finally discovered it in my 50s. Now I'm going to jump to a song that fits in thematically, another one that's just a buffet of wonderful sounds. Although it's considerably newer, it's a band I discovered 15 years ago, and I'm surprised I haven't given them their own episode yet, because I do love them. The band is Hot Chip, and it was very tough to pick one song of theirs to talk about here, but I'm going with one of my favorites, Take It In, from their fourth album, 2010's One Life Stand. Now, a bit about Hot Chip. They're in the tradition of such great eccentric British synth pop acts as New Order and even the Beta Band, bands that come across as working class folks who just happen to write amazing songs and who also do quite a bit of instrument switching on stage, which I think is great. They don't go along with a holy trinity of drums, bass, and guitar. They're not afraid to mix it up, styles, moods. Hot Chip is the kind of band I would love to see live because they're so busy on stage. There's a lot going on. They have 5 guys in the core band, but some mix of them will show up depending on the gig. And they almost always supplement that with a few associate members, typically on drums, keys, and percussion. Notably, they rarely have a bass guitar on stage. Instead, Joe Goddard plays synth bass, which is pretty cool. However, the thing that really stands out about Hot Chip, aside from their tremendous songwriting chops and fudgelicious hooks and rhythms, is their vocals. Joe Goddard shares lead vocal duties with co-founder Alexis Taylor, handling the low and high ranges respectively. but other folks can and do provide backing vocals, and the result is pretty magical. Now, I can't claim that Hot Chip is the best vocal band I've ever heard, because that metal would probably be a shootout between ABBA, Fleetwood Mac, and the B-52s, if I'm being real. But the vocal production on Take It In is pretty jaw-dropping. It just blew me out of the seat when I first heard it. I just couldn't believe this crazy song. And I did hear it first around 2010 or shortly thereafter. My kids know this song well, because it was one I must have played 1,000 times in the car back in the day, along with other Hot Chip classics like Over and Over and Brothers. And I'm sure that they could still remember all the words to those tunes. So Take It In has great vocals, but it's also a really interesting arrangement while still being a banger. See, there are kind of two parts that alternate. The verse is very creepy and dark, with Joe Goddard describing some sort of psychotic episode or near-death experience. And the synths in the second verse are especially creepy and detuned, and they create this whole weird mood. But the chorus is uplifting and beautiful, and all these voices come together to just express this love. And I don't even know what the lyrics mean here. It's just really, really beautiful. And the production is just 100% creamy goodness, as we used to say. I don't know. There must be at least 24 vocal takes layered here is all I can figure. But it's just amazing. And you might dismiss this all as just mere studio trickery, you know, nothing that the Beatles didn't do in their 4-track whilst recording Sgt. Pepper. But no, because Hot Chip managed to pull off the vocals live too, and you can watch any number of live recordings of Take It In online, and they nail it pretty much every time. It's really amazing. This is a band with some serious performance chops, and I especially dig Al Doyle's funky guitar riffing over the chorus. And side note, Al Doyle is also a member of LCD Sound System, so talk about your overachievers. I think Hot Chip is just a super creative band. Who else could write a song with this crazy vocal part? Face it, most pop songs just have someone muttering or making, as Frank Zappa used to say, pitched mouth noises. Take It In is just a different beast entirely. Check it out if you haven't heard it lately. It's just a tremendous slab of early 21st century synth pop. Next up, another upbeat number, this one from one of Manchester's great bands. No, not Joy Division or New Order or the Smiths. It's the band James. And I always feel the need to say the band James to distinguish them from what is otherwise a ridiculously common name. Obviously, they didn't have search engine optimization in mind when they named the band. I'm talking about their song Laid from their album of the same name, released in 1993. This tune was on college radio a lot. It caught my ear for its acoustic guitar hooks and the vocals that describe a pretty interesting relationship. See, the singer loves this person, but they drive each other crazy. Unfortunately, it was then used and then overused as a theme for the dopey American Pie film series, which, let's face it, is entirely based on the gimmick of a guy having sex with an apple pie. I mean, that's really all you need to know about the entire series. Now, Superbad was another film that was based on a single joke that someone would have a fake ID that just had the name McLovin on it. But at least they didn't have the bad taste to try to squeeze a whole franchise out of it. Anyway, I knew about Laid long before American Pie came along, and I think it's still a great song. It still holds up. I think it could be made into a film of its own, in fact, because the lyrics are really evocative. They paint a clear picture of particular characters who I think have an interesting story. Anyway, I'm happy to say that I saw James perform Laid a couple times live, once in 2010 when they headlined and once in 2019 when they opened for the Psychedelic Furs. Both shows were just amazing. They are yet another band, not unlike Hot Chip, with a whole stage full of people doing interesting stuff. They have a ton of energy and are great to watch. The singer, Tim Booth, is one for a lot of audience interaction. He likes to dip in and out of the crowd. And at the second show, he actually came up behind me, put a hand on my shoulder to nudge me out of the way. And I was like, who is this asshole? And I turned around and was like, oh, Damn. So Tim is a cool guy. He's also an actor, which you'll know if you follow the Batman movies, which I definitely do not. Superhero films do nothing for me, sorry. I don't dig Marvel and DC, but I do dig the good, the bad, and the ugly, but not Renegade Soundwave or Into the Groovy. So let's move on to something newer. This is one for the kids, a song that didn't come out in the 80s or the 90s or even the noughties. This is from a band that formed in 2009, a year later than my own band. That's depressing. So the band is Columbus, Ohio's own 21 Pilots. The song is from their hit fourth album, Blurry Face, which came out in 2015. And my kids brought this album to my attention, playing it in the car an awful lot. For me, the obvious standout track there was called Hometown. It harkened back to my love of anthemic synth rock. And it's pretty great. Killer beat, killer bass line, killer vocal hooks, top-notch production. Now, you gotta understand that they released a whopping 6 singles from Blurry Face out of 14 tracks. So nearly half the tracks became singles. But for some reason, they didn't pick Hometown? That's just wild to me. Now, I get that I'm not a 21 Pilots expert. My kids know a lot more about them than I ever will. But I get that they've got a big following amongst millennials and Gen Z, and that they hit a commercial peak in 2015 with this album. Hell, I knew that they hit a certain level of cultural saturation when I saw Blurry Face t-shirts for sale at every boardwalk souvenir shop. But even today, listening to this album reminds me of being at the beach. Maybe that's another reason it's a favorite of mine. But I think the band does write good songs, and in general, I like their stuff. I like music that mixes genres, but focuses somewhat on alternative rock and electronic stuff, obviously. And this fits the bill. I think Blurry Face plays like an album with high points and low points that maintain my interest, but Hometown is the sort of rave up that I'm especially looking for. Now, that said, there is something I find weird about this song, something that I find typical of these younger bands and popular music in general these days, and that is its tendency to stop and start. In particular, the drums have a way of cutting in and out, leaving these relatively quiet instrumental and a cappella sections. And I'm not sure how I feel about this trend, if that is what it is, if I'm not just hearing things. Because back in my day, we'd press play on the drum machine and blast that sumbitch through the whole song. So the rule was always, don't mistreat the beat. That's one of the golden rules of dance music. You don't mistreat the beat. The other rule is always hit the one. You know, I've listened to enough Bootsy Collins to have learned that lesson. And this is especially true for the drummer and the bassist. According to Bootsy, you can play whatever you want, but always hit the one. So it's weird to me to hear a dance song, especially one as short as Hometown, that keeps cutting out the drums. I mean, what the hell? And sure, you can argue that Hometown isn't a dance song, but you'd be wrong. Listen to that bass. Listen to those drums. This is a friggin' dance anthem. It is Stadium House in the style of the KLF, which is the best style. So yeah, I'm not sure what to make of that. I don't know. Maybe dance music has just evolved beyond my understanding, which is admittedly a low bar. Maybe Gen X pioneered the loud, soft dynamic, whereas millennials pioneered the start-stop dynamic. You know, each generation puts its own little stamp on things, and previous generations just find it puzzling. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Blurry Face album probably know it for its hit single, Stressed Out, which is an ode of sorts to realizing that you have to eventually grow up, or at least get older, which links us to our next and final song, which has that same theme. In fact, I think this last band has a lot in common with 21 Pilots, despite the fact that they are a little older, having formed in 2002 in Deepest, Connecticut. Maybe not a place that comes to mind as a bastion for alternative rock, but here they are, MGMT, and the lead-off song, Time to Pretend, off their lead-off album, Oracular Spectacular, released in 2007. And what a splash that album was. The whole album has got that kitchen sink production approach that I love. All sorts of grimy synths and beats and samples and rock instruments and vocal effects just stirred together in this messy bouillabaisse. I just love it. It's big, it's bombastic. Time to Pretend comes on as a statement of intent from this then duo. It was tapped as the first single naturally, and the album went on to much success and went on to spawn the somewhat more successful third single, Kids, which you may well recognize, or at least you might recognize the sound of it because it was all over the place for many years. But my pick here on this album is Time to Pretend because it harkens back to youthful innocence, a time for dreaming big dreams when you weren't afraid to finger paint with wild abandon and make a mess before you learned to control it all so much and discovered technical drawing with 0.5 millimeter rapidographs. So some part of me wants to get back to wild finger painting, to unlearn all of my refined adulthood. I think my cats would definitely like it. Mrs. Stronger Than Reason might have some objections, maybe, unless I took it outside. But you know, this song is all about thinking big, not worrying about staying in the lines and maybe just abandoning the lines altogether. And there's something to be said for that, about not taking life too seriously, even when it is hard, and it does get hard. It's about never being too old to dream. You know, I was in a movie theater recently, which is strange enough because I'm not really a movie guy. I mean, I like movies, but I'm rarely in theaters unless the rest of the family has something they really want to see. Anyway, I was suffering through endless previews, as you do, and was surprised to suddenly hear Time to Pretend. I admit I could not remember what show this was for, so I just looked it up on Wikipedia a few minutes ago, which, as we know, is the next best thing to learning something. Turns out it was during the preview for the Minecraft movie. Not a movie I plan to see, despite the director's solid taste in music. But I figured Time to Pretend was a good choice to pimp that flick since it has a touch of whimsy about it. And there you have it, folks. We're going to put a pin in it right there. 9 songs. That's a half-decent mixtape back in the day. It is a bento box of delectable tunes, a Whitman sampler of snappy songs, a charcuterie board of... never mind. But I did kind of like this idea of a mixtape show. It gave me a chance to talk about some bands I probably never would have talked about because I'm only into a song or two, and it also gave me a chance to talk about a few bands that I've been meaning to talk about for years and finally got to, at least a little bit. So yeah, this is like wrapping up loose ends in a way, or like spring cleaning. Yeah, that's it. It's spring cleaning, except that spring is still 62 days, 3 hours, 12 minutes, and 45 seconds away as I speak. But, you know, who's counting? You're listening to Stronger Than Reason on YouTube or the podcast platform of your choice. The show that is west of a White House. There is a mailbox here. Opening the mailbox reveals a leaflet. Take and read leaflet. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. Stronger Than Reason is a podcast of adventure, danger, and low cunning. In it, you will explore some of the most amazing bands ever seen by mortals. No smartphone should be without one. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay strong.